So we've always been sold on the principle of one person, one vote. And yet and still, in the documentary Slaying the Dragon, we have a chance to really explore on a relatively deep level the exact reasons why that saying, that belief, that cultural thing that we've all been inculcated to here in America, where one person equals one vote, may not mean nearly as much as we've been taught to believe it does. This is Let's Talk About It by No Alter Egos, and I'm Trll Kennedy. Welcome back to Let's Talk About It by No Alter Egos. I'm your host, Trll Kennedy, and just want to welcome everyone in this week. For anyone that's listening on the radio, of course, you always know we are broadcast every single Monday at 2 p.m. on WHPB 98.5 The Wire in Orlando, Florida, as well as WUVS 103.7 The Beat in Muskegon, Michigan. And if you missed the Monday show, don't worry about it. We have a Tuesday 3 p.m. rebroadcast on WVBH LP in Benton Harbor, Michigan. Or if you missed the radio shows entirely, feel free to check out our YouTube channel, the No Alter Egos podcast. We do a 5 p.m. Tuesday episode drop every single week. It's a video drop of that week's radio show. So if you've ever wanted to see my face, put a face to the voice, go over to our YouTube channel, the No Alter Egos podcast, like, comment, and subscribe. You can check out podcasts from earlier in this year. We just started doing the video companions earlier this year. Of course, as I said, if you do happen to miss it on the radio, or even if you're listening in on the radio, go to our YouTube channel. Once again, that's the No Alter Egos podcast. Like, comment, and subscribe on the vids. Check out some of the other podcasts, some of the Let's Talk About It, as well as the weekly podcasts that we have done or that I have done from earlier in this year. For everyone that's been listening, thank you guys so much for listening. And for all my Michigan listeners, well, before we even get into that, obviously, as I said in the intro, my name is Trll Kennedy, and you can find me on Instagram at TRLL KENNEDY. So that's Trll Kennedy, but with no I. Or you can find the podcast, the No Alter Egos podcast, on both Facebook and Instagram at No Alter Egos. And once again, that's at No Alter Egos for the Facebook and Instagram page. I'd love to have you guys give the show a like and a follow. And of course, once again, don't forget to go to the YouTube channel, hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell so that you can get notified every single time a new episode drops. For those who are listening in on the radio and have been listening in, thank you guys once again. The support is always loved and appreciated. Feel free to reach out to me, whether it's at the show's handle or at my own personal handle, to let me know what you think about the episodes on a week-to-week basis. But for everyone that is inside Michigan, this week's show is pretty relevant to you guys in that the heart of the documentary that we're going to explore this week actually takes place inside the state of Michigan. As I stated in the intro, and we're going to give just a little bit of intro to the doc itself before we get into the themes that this documentary explores, and finally a synopsis of the doc itself. But just for a little bit of background / intro information, when I told you that one person, one vote does not necessarily count the way that we think it does here in America, it really doesn't. The crazy thing is we are so sold on this idea that we have these unalienable freedoms, that we have been granted these rights that we have supposedly been blessed with by God above. And what we don't realize is that over time, those rights have been eroded and eroded and eroded and eroded. And it's to the point now where we essentially are picking between some of the worst people we can possibly pick because we feel locked into this two-party dilemma, which is what some of the founding fathers were worried about if we ever got into that two-party political system where we'd be getting two sides of the same coin. But I digress. What the doc really hones in on, and what I really wanted to point out and say, is that we've sacrificed so much of our general rights that we don't even realize that one person, one vote doesn't mean the same thing anymore. And it's all thanks to the practice of gerrymandering. It should be gerrymandering because of the man that it's named after. But that's what this doc really explores, and it explores it through the eyes and the story of Katie Fahey and the Voters Not Politicians organization that she helped to really put into a national spotlight when they worked to make sure that the legislative districts inside of Michigan could not be drawn by legislators, but would instead be drawn by a citizens council. Now, the story evolves into that, but that's just a little bit of the background on what this doc explores. It explores the practice of gerrymandering, its historical use, and what radically changed about it, especially in the 2010 midterm elections after the election of President Obama as the first African-American president of this country. But it's It's an interesting look for sure at exactly what it takes to get the wheels of politics moving in our country when you don't have a ton of money that you're starting out with. In fact, it juxtaposes what happens when you do have a ton of money to start out with and you just plan well, as opposed to when you just have this idea and you're trying to galvanize a public movement behind this idea that has started up inside of your head. So that's one of the cool things that this documentary does, is it presents all these really interesting viewpoints all coming together inside of this one narrative to tell the story of how this really partisan practice that has been used throughout our history to greater and lesser effects has been weaponized to an extreme degree, really in the past decade and a half, to the point where now our legislative districts are almost unrecognizable in terms of shapes, and they are so surgically precise that they can work to disenfranchise certain voters by ensuring that even though you live in a certain place and you may be surrounded, they can draw district lines that cut through neighborhoods and cut right down the middle of streets. I mean, that's technically what they're supposed to do anyways, but the way that they've drawn it now is really so skillfully precise that they have managed to stack the game in favor of politicians, incumbent elected officials. They know that once they get into a seat, especially in a year ending in zero, so 2010, 2020, the next opportunity will be 2030, they get to redraw those legislative districts. And when they do, they have a chance to really, like a tick, burrow into the halls of power and don't get out at all. That's one of the crazier things that I believe this doc really does introduce us to. But before we do, let's jump into just some of the main themes, some of the other main themes that it explores. So obviously, first and foremost is gerrymandering, the practice of gerrymandering, why it has been a politically useful tool in the past, why it is still an extremely useful tool politically, but really to the detriment of democracy now, and why it's still allowed to be a practice in terms of the way that legislative districts are drawn and legislative and representative power is doled out here in the United States. And that's a question that we could go all the way back to the framing of the Constitution itself to really get some answers to peer into their minds, but that's a whole other subject in itself. So this is the big overarching theme, right? This theme of gerrymandering and what it really means overall to you as an individual voter inside of our political system, no matter the state that you live in. But it is focused really mainly in Michigan, although it touches on several other states, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Wisconsin, and whatnot. But yeah, that's probably the biggest theme that gets explored throughout this doc. And it's something that drew me in because I didn't even realize how consequential the 2010 midterms were until I realized how they used gerrymandering in the aftermath of that to really lock their wins in, especially on the state legislative level. Now, the second theme, and one that I think is going to be really grossly overlooked by a lot of people, but it's the determination of Katie Fahey. And really, in a broader context and sense, it's about the determination that a really motivated woman can have, the impact that she can have on our societies. And it's told through this young woman, Katie Fahey, who realizes what's going on inside of her state, that there are people who are being actively harmed. And this is all, and I'll get into it really in the synopsis, just a lot of her background story and how she came to be in the organization that she helped to build up, came to be really the centerpiece of this documentary. But just to know what she had to go through, there were a lot of things that were happening, and there was bad legislation that was being essentially like rammed down the people's throats, for lack of a better term. And even though they were protesting, they were still having their voices ignored. And it galvanized something within her to really find out why it is that politicians felt so safe within their seats that they could actively write and create and enact laws that were totally against the will of the people and their constituents, and not be worried about getting voted out or losing their jobs for passing that kind of legislation. And so the second thing that it explores is really just this immense determination that was birthed inside of Katie Fahey. And as I said, in a broader context, the determination that a motivated woman or motivated women can have when they want to get a movement started. It was really incredible to see someone who didn't picture themselves as a leader of people, right, get up and take on those qualities of leadership and learn along the way to get and create a better world for her contemporaries, and the future of humanity, to be quite honest. Now, the third big theme that this documentary explores is really the skillfully cruel measures that have been honed to such a fine point over time, but those skillfully cruel measures that get put in place to really harm the public good and to ensure that the lowest sectors, if you will, of the American populace, the have-nots in a very real sense, are disenfranchised and don't have near the kind of power in society that they should have just based on a numbers game. It's extraordinary to see, and this is the third theme that gets explored, not just gerrymandering specifically, but how there are always obstacles and roadblocks put in place by the people who are in power. And of course, we know that started off with the landed gentry, the rich aristocracy. They are the founding fathers. And over time, as we leaned into this model of what is now commonly known or referred to as a Jacksonian democracy, where the common people can gain power in the representative halls. And then with the Citizens United ruling and corporations being recognized as people and the dark money start to flow into politics, there is a building layer after layer story that really encompasses the totality of all the efforts that have been made since the founding of this republic to ensure that even though there is a certain number of people here on the physical landmass of the United States, that their voices can only get but so far, and that the real people who are supposed to be running this country can run it relatively unimpeded or with as little opposition as possible. And the game has gotten so effective now, especially with the specific practice of gerrymandering, but it's just another tool, that no matter how people try and get together, perform activism with each other, and build and try and change and improve, those in power can, with a stroke of the pen, get together and shut those improvements down, can go against the will of the people. And they've made it essentially so that they're well entrenched. So that's the third theme that I think this documentary really does explore in an incredible way, which is this idea that there has always been a set of people who have been incredibly determined to continue to really pull at the levers and the pulleys of power inside of this country. And over time, they have honed their tactics down. And while this documentary does focus on gerrymandering as one of the specific tactics, there are other tactics that are revealed as a result of the gerrymandering that also serve as impedences to people's civic duties, to their real right to participate inside of our democracy. And so that was a really big theme that I think gets explored in an overarching way, not just the gerrymandering, but how there's always, and there always seemingly will be, new tools of oppression to disenfranchise voters, or just generally to make sure that those who are on the lower part of the social totem pole know their place and stay in their place. And then theme number 4, which cannot go overlooked, and it's something that I'm noticing more and more. It's almost like this pattern that's formed, especially with some of these political documentaries that I've had a chance to watch recently. It's that Republican strategists are brilliant, cunning, ruthless, and efficient. We're going to get to know this character, this guy, Chris Jankowski, who's a Republican strategist in the mold of a Paul Weyrich. I mean, and Paul Weyrich, if you don't know who he is, he's one of the co-founders of ALEC, who is also going to get mentioned. ALEC has been mentioned in the 13th documentary. They're going to get mentioned here again, the American Legislative Exchange Council. It's where corporations and mostly state, but some national legislators get together to decide what laws they want passed, what laws they want hindered. It's really done out in the open. Now, it's covered up by ALEC saying that they just propose legislation, but they propose legislation while greasing the wheels heavily with money, and or implying that if legislation isn't passed, then they'll fund primary opponents to help those who don't go along with the agendas lose their job. It's really out in the open. But you're going to see ALEC crop up inside of this documentary again because of the fact that they were involved with this push. But that's the biggest thing, or not the biggest, but it's one of those biggest things I'm taking away in an overarching theme, is that Republican strategists are brilliant. If we're talking about reversing Roe or 13th, when you're talking about the way that they got people together and turned late pregnancy abortions due to like health complications. They coined the term partial birth abortions, or if you're talking about how one of Nixon's strategists admitted that because they couldn't both demonize black people and the college students who were protesting the war, they lumped them together and attributed drug use to them. So to the black people, they attributed heroin. To the college students and young people who were opposed to Vietnam, they attributed marijuana and said they were ne'er-do-wells and all this stuff. Even leading up to the Kent State massacre, where several college students were killed for protesting the war. It's really important for us to know that the Republican machine, and really not just the Republican machine, but conservative politics here in this country has been operating under the same political roof, if you will, honing their ideas and plans down for decades at a minimum. I'm talking all the way back to the 1940s, 1930s, and even before that, where they were plotting together. But with Nixon's Southern strategy, we really saw the Republican Party. And it started, even with Barry Goldwater and segregationists. There was a marked shift in Republican values, but the Southern strategy really is what transformed the party from the party of Lincoln, where they were the party of abolition, into the party that it is today, which represents hyper-conservative values. And they have been operating with some really brilliant minds towards particular ends and goals for a long time now. I know it's been decades at least, because in the wake of Roe v. Wade being overturned, they got to work on a generation of rich elite kids to make sure that a Brett Kavanaugh and an Amy Coney Barrett would end up on the Supreme Court, that a Neil Garouche would end up on the Supreme Court, such that Roe v. Wade has now been overturned. It is an extremely long game that, especially on the conservative/Republican side of U.S. politics, they have been playing with a ruthless efficiency and with much more togetherness for quite some time now. I'm talking way, way longer than the Democrats have. It almost seems as though the Democrats are just flying by the seat of their pants with every new election cycle, while with Republicans, there's been this slow cascade. Now, Trump obviously was a monster of their creation, and this is certainly not to jump into the politics of that. But it is to say that Republican strategists especially have been brilliant, for lack of a better term. It's been ruthless and cruel, but brilliant in a way, because they've been able to win over tens of millions of voters, generation after generation after generation. And they've managed to constantly get in and use the levers of power in our political system to their advantage consistently every time. And it's no different. We see Chris Jankowski inside of this documentary execute a flawless plan and strategy for the 2010 midterm elections to guarantee a shift in power, especially on the state legislative level. And he did it for a political bargain by just going through and scoping out the races. And we're going to get to that as we discuss the synopsis. But that's the fourth big theme that I think gets explored by this documentary really well, is the fact that Republican strategists have been beating Democratic strategists to the point. And I think it's because Democratic strategists are just worried about fundraising. I don't know that they realize that once you speak on a progressive agenda, as it were, you have to get into office and do something about it. Otherwise, you're going to cause your voters to be apathetic. And it's been generations of the same thing. In the meanwhile, Republicans have understood that even if we're promising hell, when we get into power, we're going to raise hell. And they've been doing it. And one of the main reasons why is because they have people on their side that have really trained themselves to think outside of the box politically with how money can be used to influence our elections and ensure that certain people of a certain mindset get put into the right places, and especially in important election years. Like 2020 was just another important election year, because as a presidential election year, but even as there was going to be changes in the Senate and the House, it was an important time for gerrymandering. Even though we had the pandemic, even though there was the lockdown, gerrymandering was still going on. And we won't have another chance to redo the legislative districts for another 8 years. Well, 7 years and change now, but it won't be until the 2030 census that we have another chance to approach it. So it's been incredible seeing the strategy used by Republicans and the long game thinking that they tend to employ every time they're approaching matters of politics. and what it means to try and hold on to and maintain power inside of our democracy or representative republic, whatever you want to call it. But yeah, those are some of the really big themes that this doc explores. And I don't want to spend any more time. Let's dive on into a synopsis before I give my overall thoughts, and we'll jump into our final thought for this week. So let's slay the dragon. Let's get into the synopsis and flow of this documentary. It starts off in Flint, Michigan, addressing the water crisis, showing how there are almost toxic lead levels, how the children are being slowly poisoned. It's really affecting their genuine physical health and their developmental outlooks and prognoses. It's affecting the kids in Flint. It's affecting the people, and it gives a look into the heart of this water crisis. But what it does next is really important. Is it takes the origins of the water crisis all the way back to the 2010 midterm elections, when there was essentially an overwhelming sweep inside of the state legislature, both in the state house and the state senate, as well as the governorship. They all went red in 2010 in Michigan. And as they went red in Michigan, and as people were kind of reacting to this major red wave, if you will, which, as someone who had been listening to conservative talk radio, I kind of felt it coming in the vitriol that was being spewed towards President Obama by the Sean Hannitys and Rush Limbaughs and Glenn Becks and Mark Levin's of the world. Like, it was really, I'm not going to say disheartening, but it was a really critical insight. I would say it was disheartening if I expected, I guess, any better, but it was a really critical insight into the right-wing media sphere and what was being said. And so the 2010 midterm elections, we had the Tea Party back then, and you got to wonder where that stuff all comes from psychologically, but I won't digress into that. I will say that, yeah, there was this red wave that took place. And in the 2010 midterm elections, as there was this change in the representative look of Michigan in terms of it becoming this red-led state in terms of being led by the Republicans, there were these emergency managers that the new legislature and governor decided would go into effect across the state of Michigan. And what those emergency managers were essentially in charge of was they were given carte blanche over the cities. So if you had an emergency manager dispatched to your city, essentially they came in and could overrule down to the mayor themselves. They would decide how the city's budget was going to be spent. It was an emergency financial manager. So they would decide how the city's budget was going to be spent, the major budgetary decisions, and they could make cuts and things like that. Carte blanche. They didn't need anyone else to sign off. They were given these special emergency powers by the governor and the legislature. And it's one of these emergency managers, the emergency manager for Flint, who essentially switches the city's water supply from the Detroit-based water supply system into the Flint River to save a little bit of money. And they do that without properly treating the water either, or allocating any more budgetary resources to making sure that the water is potable, drinkable, that it won't harm people in Flint. Call it an oversight. I call it purposeful cruelty. The Flint water crisis was one of the first events to give a look back, and I love how they peeled the layers of that onion back to show that it wasn't just this water crisis, but if you look beneath the water crisis, you can see that because of these 2010 midterm elections, the people that were elected into power, they decided to come up with the emergency managers. The emergency manager gets sent out to Flint. He's one of several, and he decides that your water supply is no longer going to go from this clean, trusted source because it costs a little too much money that I want for your city's budget. We're going to go over to the Flint River, and in doing so, he introduces toxic chemicals such as lead into the drinking and bathing and cooking water supply for all of the residents of this city in Michigan, a city that was really once the heart of Michigan. But I love how it traces back, because you need to know and understand that this isn't just some outlier event, that there are specific forces that have been put in play that have worked together to arrive us at this point where there is now a water crisis in Flint. But let's carry on. I mentioned the Flint water crisis and how they trace it back because, as I said, that's what the documentary essentially does. One of the other things that they show is that with the initial onset and onslaught of these emergency managers into cities like Detroit, like Flint, there was a huge public backlash. because they could come in and renegotiate contracts with vendors and just change up the way things were being run in cities across the state of Michigan. There was a real huge public uproar and outcry over these emergency managers. In fact, it was so strong that just 2 years later, voters got together in Michigan and voted to strike down the emergency manager law. They voted to repeal it and get it off the books in Michigan. And what really began to show the main character, if you will, of the doc, Katie Fahey, that things weren't as they seemed, was that politicians literally went back after the initial one got repealed, changed the wording up a little bit inside of the new enactment of this emergency manager law, and they put new wording in it to make sure it was essentially non-repealable. And they reenacted essentially the same law, just with a few tweaks to make it more effective at sticking. And this is when someone like a Katie Fahey realized, okay, wait. So we go in, we get together, and we vote in droves to tell you that we hate this policy. And you just go right back out and enact the same policy again. They're spitting in the faces of their voters. Why do they not have any fear of losing their seats? Why don't they feel beholden to the will of their voters? This is the question that incepted inside of her mind. She began to ask herself, why is it that politicians can literally, it's not even like, oh, they're just not doing their jobs. They're being antithetical to the will of the people. And it was that question and idea inside of her mind that inspired her to go make a Facebook post to say, hey, I'm not really sure what's going on with our politicians and why they seem to care even less now. But I want to take a look at this thing called gerrymandering, and would anyone be interested in learning more about what it's about and seeing what we can do about it? And she began to research and take a look at the practice of gerrymandering as it has historically stood up inside of our country and been used politically inside of our country. And the doc, to its credit at this point, does an incredible job of not only giving the history of gerrymandering, which is named after Elbridge Gerry. He was the 8th governor of Massachusetts, and actually his opinions helped to shape certain parts of the Constitution. Not to say that he was one of the direct writers, but he certainly did contribute from a thought perspective to our U.S. Constitution. But at any rate, gerrymandering is named after him because while he was the governor of Massachusetts, the newly formed state in the newly independent United States, he drew these really crazy political districts inside of his state. And so the practice of drawing abnormal political districts, as it were, stuck around. And of course, it was used effectively once we got into a two-party system to really carve up districts that were not necessarily totally lopsided, but certainly they were dependable, if you will. It then goes on to show how there's two main ways that gerrymandering takes place whenever these political map makers are deciding how they want to draw the legislative district maps. There's a strategy called packing, where they essentially lump all particular voters of a certain kind together inside of the same district. And in doing so, you may have a population center where you're going to have X amount of people that vote and get you someone in that seat that's maybe blue, but there are going to be tons of other legislative districts around it where we've now isolated what will essentially be majority red votes. And so, and by the way, if you're not aware of exactly how powerful the technology is these days, they know everything from your height to your eye color to your voting history, how you voted in past elections, what your current registered party is, whether it's Democrat, Republican, Independent, or one of the other non-mainstream political parties inside of our country. But there's a ton of information available on you as a voter. And it's not even just the voter stuff. Like, they have your social media profiles as well, so your likes and dislikes. And they're actually able to extrapolate how your likes and dislikes relate or correlate to your voting tendencies as a voter. It's really precise stuff now. And so the packing technique is designed to give away a few districts in return for having more seats in the halls of power. That's the first main strategy of gerrymandering. And the second is called cracking. So it's packing and cracking. Whereas with packing, you pack the voters into one district, giving them a seat, but surrounding them with 4 or 5 other seats where they won't be able to get legislation passed that will affect the state because they're essentially outnumbered. But in cracking, the strategy is the reverse, if you will, which is, let's say you have a population center of people. If you draw the legislative district such that when you know you have a cluster of potentially Democratic voters, you can siphon off each individual part of that cluster into a new legislative district where, even though together those votes would have counted for much, they're so outnumbered by Republican voters now that their votes will get cast but essentially be absorbed. And so it's gotten to this point now where they can create politically safe seats. It's not just dependable, but it's to the point where once an incumbent gets in, they can draw those maps so that the only thing the incumbent has to worry about is a primary challenger. But someone of the other political party, based on the people that live there and all the information they have on them, it's going to be borderline impossible for them to win that political seat because people vote like usually how their parents voted or how they were taught to vote. It's sad that we as a citizenry don't really evolve, at least on a mass level. But it is what it is. I'm just speaking the truth about the current situation. And this doc, once again, does a really wonderful job of demonstrating how these tactics of packing and cracking have gone on to create these politically safe seats. So it wasn't just a matter of getting people elected, it was a matter of keeping them in their seats after they had been elected. It flips the game of democracy, right? It essentially says that instead of voters picking their representatives, every 10 years, representatives get to pick their voters. We don't think of it that way, but that's the literal truth of how this system is set up and how it effectively runs in practice here in our country. And so as it dives into this history of gerrymandering, it then goes into its relative use in the modern day. Now, 2008 was a really bad year for the Republican Party. I'm talking very bad. They were coming off of a lame duck president who had sat for 8 years, who had taken the country into war, been the president during 9/11, and what's worse, as he was coming to the end of his presidency, there was an economic crash, the likes of which hadn't been seen really in several generations. There had been ups and downs to the economy, but the 2008 crash was really horrible. The practice of subprime mortgage lending came to take its toll on the housing market. And so in 2008, we see President Barack Obama, this idea and vision of hope, get pushed out to the American people. And really against the odds, because even though he was offering this message, people weren't sure that America as a country was at the point yet where they would elect a black man as the leader, the figurehead of our country. And yet they did. Barack Obama ended up becoming our 44th president. And in addition to him becoming the president, the Republicans found themselves losing big time in both the House and the Senate. They were losing seats left and right. It was almost like a clean sweep, a blue wave, if you will, in 2008. And what happened? The machine got put into motion. As I said, I was a college student at the time, young, but still, figuring out where I wanted to be politically, learning more about the world, and just seeing where my values aligned with. And it's not to say that I was thinking about becoming a conservative, but I never wanted to be the kind of person that kept myself willfully ignorant to the thought patterns and the influences of those who thought different from what I did. I didn't believe in that. And so I took on the challenge in the wake of President Obama's election to sit and listen daily to conservative talk radio from like 9 in the morning all the way up till 7, 8 p.m. at night. The same guys coming in saying the same messaging. And so that's why I said I kind of was a bit privy to the fact that 2010 wasn't going to be a great year for the Democratic Party, at least if they didn't salvage the economy and really work on a progressive agenda that had been, promised by President Obama. And lo and behold, although they were able to help salvage the economy, he was not nearly as aggressive on some of his campaign promises as he should have been. The media machine was extraordinarily effective on the conservative side of things. And there was this red wave that took place in 2010. But what the doc goes and highlights at this point is that that red wave wasn't just a result of the media machine, if you will. It was all a part of a concerted strategy known as Project Red Map. It was a redistricting map redrawing strategy drawn up by political strategist Chris Jankowski, a Republican strategist, who in the wake of the 2008 losses saw that the Republican Party was falling out of touch. The demographic shifts in this country indicate that each and every day the country becomes less white, more diverse. And the Republicans have made themselves, they've really been burrowing, even in a more hardcore way, into this brand of identity politics where they are putting themselves out there as the last bastion of hope for, and this is the quiet part, white America, but they call it real America. And they have other euphemisms that they'll use for it. But at any rate, Jankowski sits and comes up with this plan where he says that we can win, I believe it was like 116 key races across 14 or so states, that we're looking to just, if we can funnel these amount of dollars in. And so he begins to go in all these state legislature races around the country in key swing states like Michigan, Wisconsin, even in Texas, Florida, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Ohio. They begin looking at all these state legislature races in states that could also be swing states in presidential elections. And they begin looking at how much money is it going to take? How much money can we funnel in? And usually you have a bunch of money that gets funneled into politics, but that's because people are spending blindly. If you're effective with the way that you use your money, what they were able to do is go out to people like Alec, like the Koch brothers and Koch Industries, and they were able to say, hey, look, or he was able to say, hey, look, I have this plan. It's called Project Red Map, and all I need is $30 million, and I can get you guys these seats in these states. And after which, Alec especially, you can go in, Koch Industries, you guys in your lobbying firms that you use can go in and begin proposing laws, or we can centralize kind of the laws that we want to get passed and push them out to the people that we get elected into power here. But it's going to take about $30 million to win all of these races in these key states. And then after that, the fun begins. And that's what they did. They effectively funded their way into a huge win. They realized that they had to get a little more granular with the politics. And so they reshaped state politics. And in doing so, they were given the keys to gerrymandering so they could really entrench those wins and victories that they had fought for leading up to the 2010 midterm. So Chris Jankowski comes in and essentially makes himself a savior of the modern Republican Party with Project Red Map and his plan that they executed for the 2010 midterm elections. And as I said, it was a brilliant move. It really was a brilliant strategic move politically, because once they won, it was like clockwork. They didn't waste any time. And this is where Tom Hofeller comes in. If you're not familiar with Tom Hofeller, he is a legislative map maker. He draws these maps these days using technology more than anything, but he's extremely and extraordinarily effective at drawing out the political maps that will decide and shape the power structure of state legislatures. And he does this all around the country. And that's what they did. As soon as they began winning these states, as soon as there was this red wave, communiques and memos went out. Hey, you guys, you're newly elected. You want to take some time to celebrate the win. Why don't we take some of the pressure off of your mind and tell you the legislative agendas and things that we'd like to see get done inside of your states? And they just passed it on around to them. They said, hey, now that we've helped to get you into power, this is what we need done. And by God, if they didn't do it, and we saw it play itself out in the beginning of the doc with the emergency managers in Flint. We saw when Scott Walker became the governor, how he went in and essentially gutted collective bargaining rights for public employees, for government employees, and how even though there were people protesting, they still were sitting and gerrymandering the state in a secret room in a law firm that was right outside one of the big protest streets, which was happening in front of the Capitol. There was a law firm located essentially across the street. And while the people were protesting, they were in a literal secret room deciding the political maps for the state, because that's what it was, man. The whole objective was to get into power and then work to maintain it essentially by any means. And they did just that. The doc goes on to make a comparison that up until the 2010 midterms, gerrymandering was in its minor league era. There were some politically interesting districts that were drawn, but in 2010, it went from the minor leagues directly into like its steroids era. Between big data and AI, they were able to draw surgically precise legislative maps that would ensure that Republicans could maintain the control that they had won in those 2010 midterms. If you've been wondering why the country is on this politically conservative arc and bend over the past decade or so, it's because once the Republicans won power, they said, yeah, I'm not trying to give this back. We know and understand the long game. And so the gerrymandering that they engaged in is now at this point where their districts, once they get in, they're like ticks. They're just in there. They are burrowed in and they are latched on. There's even this chef's kiss moment that occurs in the doc when this political strategist or Republican strategist, again, Carter Wren, comes on camera and says, we weren't looking to harm African Americans. We were only looking to harm Democrats. And that's the closest you're going to get to them saying the quiet part out loud. It's just euphemism. They're just euphemistically saying the quiet part out loud, which is that black voters tend to vote more so for Democrats because their social and fiscal policies tend to be more inclusive towards everyone and not exclusive and to everyone's detriment, while benefiting a small handful of the private sector who are the richest in the country. It's I don't know, man. It's really hard to wrap my head around sometimes. But yeah, they essentially said the quiet part out loud, which is that they're making these maps knowing what they're trying to do is strip power away from a certain political party, but it's a certain political party that represents the interests of certain sects or sets of people inside of this country that they feel shouldn't have nearly as much power politically as they do have. And so gerrymandering as a tool right now is being used actively to disenfranchise voters. And we're going to get to that in just a second. I'm not just saying that to say it. I'm saying that there's specific strategies that gerrymandering has now allowed to come into play because incumbents are politically safe. They don't have to worry about losing their seat to someone from the other party. They just have to worry about primary challengers who may be willing to push the envelope a little bit further. Now, at this point, after having gone through the whole history of gerrymandering and how, even though it was used historically politically, it's in this completely different and really Wild West era right now. It switches back from this giant political machine that's been operating to win political districts and to take over the country state by state onto this one organization in Michigan that this young woman, Katie Leahy, is doing her best to try and build up now, feeling disenfranchised as a voter. They need to get 350,000 signatures because at first they had to bring it to the state elections board, which voted to let the ballot be on the measure if they're able to procure the necessary signatures, which is around 350,000. And so they set out. There's a real grassroots movement, and they end up getting no paid volunteers, but actual volunteers from the state to go out, to go around and collect these signatures to the point where there were a bunch of people that doubted it was even a real movement. It shows news clips from shows that look like they have a politically conservative kind of bend to them, saying that, are you guys serious? Essentially treating them like it was a bunch of kids trying to have a seat at the adult table. But to their credit, Voters Not Politicians, that's the organization that Katie was really working with to build up this coalition, they went out and they secured all the signatures that they needed to make sure that this thing got onto the ballot initiative. And they were so good at it that another one of the villains from the movie then gets introduced at this point in the story. After they land all those signatures, they begin to realize that, okay, like we thought this was going to be the hard part, but we got it. Now we have to look for some of the pitfalls because they know and understand that the legislators that are at the state level who have won those seats aren't going to want to give their seats away or lose their jobs. And so they're going to have some kind of strategy that they come up with to try and make sure this thing doesn't get through. That is going to be coming up in just a second, but the story in the documentary now shifts over to the state of Wisconsin. It discusses how the Republicans were so brilliant in 2010, not only because they managed to interrupt a political cycle that seemed to have doomed their party, but they did so drumming up a ton of grassroots support, playing on certain old resentments, but playing on them extraordinarily effectively. And they didn't just plot to get into power, they plotted on how to wield that power once they got into it. It goes to the state of Wisconsin and shows how Governor Scott Walker comes in and through this thing called Act 10 works to strip the collective bargaining rights of public sector employees inside of the state of Wisconsin, essentially threatening some of the largest unions in the state. And you would think that in a state that has been very much pro-union, that was built by unions, this would be political suicide. But he has no fear of pulling off the maneuver. In fact, as there were protests happening outside of his office, he was prank called by someone who posed as David Koch, one of the Koch brothers, essentially saying, how are they handling things? And he was so ready to pay deference and respect to this rich man he thought could do something. And he was like, yeah, they're crying and complaining, but what are they going to do about it? He essentially was saying, yeah, we're doing what we were hired by you to do. And it was a crank call, but it just was a peek into the mindset of this man that's the governor of Wisconsin and why he feels as though he can say or do anything at this point. It's because they knew that the seats were bought and paid for and that they'd been hired to get a certain agenda passed. And moreover, Walker admits to being on calls with other governors like John Kasich of Ohio, essentially strategizing, like even with Rick Scott of Florida, but they were working to crush public sector unions around the country. It wasn't just this one governor in this one state. It was that Republican governors were strategizing about how they could crush public unions around the country, state by state. And as I said, it was so well thought out. That's the one thing that it impresses and scares me at the same time. But the doc shows that they really did think out the fact that they didn't just want to get into power, they wanted to use it effectively. And so it highlights how the same strategy is used over and over again in states like Pennsylvania, Florida, and whatnot, how these copycat laws are almost being passed, and dives into a history of how the organization ALEC has worked in the past after gerrymandering and winning seats, or after winning seats and gerrymandering, how they've worked to get these really harsh voter ID laws and other restrictive laws meant to disenfranchise voters. For example, in Pennsylvania, they were looking after the 2018 midterms to strip away early voting, to strip away, in Georgia even, they removed the ability for volunteers to hand out water in long voting lines. These are all things that are meant, they can talk about voting security and integrity all they want. What they're really trying to do is discourage people. And I've already realized that the game is to discourage people. If you think about how the fourth or the first Tuesday of November in our election years, it should be a national recognized holiday. It should be a federal holiday, but it's not. People have to try and take time off, try and find little hours and time in the day to go vote. And there are a lot of people who, by the nature and virtue of a work schedule, can't get out and exercise their civic duty. That's why things like early voting exist. But then when you work to strip away early voting, when you make it so that election day is not a federally recognized holiday, then you make it so that what you're trying to say is you don't want people voting. And it shows a clip of Paul Weyrich saying that he's not looking to get people to vote. He's, in fact, the less people that vote, it's the better for him and his kind. But we're going to get to the heart and wrap up of this documentary because it really does have a satisfying conclusion as a documentary. So what's a good story without its villain? And this story really does have its share of villains, from Chris Jankowski to Carter Wren and some other strategists and people to Scott Walker, Rick Scott, and the powerful men who have used their power to really make people's lives worse while enriching a few of their buddies and friends. There are plenty of villains to choose from, but really one of the main villains comes in the form of Robert LeBrant. Now, what Mr. LeBrant works to do is essentially nullify the work that Katie and her team have been doing. He sues their ballot measure that, even though they managed to get it passed, he sues to have it prevented from going on the ballot, claiming that it's too constitutionally broad and would affect the state constitution too broadly to be considered by all the voters. And in fact, a lot of Michigan State Supreme Court justices, they are Republican appointed justices. There is a conservative majority inside of the Michigan Supreme Court. So one judge initially sides with Katie and voters, not politicians, but it gets kicked up and appealed to the state Supreme Court, at which point they have to appear before the state Supreme Court. And this is part of a larger battle because there's actually a whole U.S. Supreme Court battle that they end up engaging in, where the Supreme Court kicks the decision back down to the lower courts because it says that voting practices and policies in states are a states' rights issues and shouldn't be left up to the federal court system to determine what's right and what's wrong. But the long and short of it is that Mr. LeBrand, who is one of the key masterminds behind the 2011 gerrymander that created the new political and legislative districts in the state of Michigan, that really carved up power and put it into Republican hands in a really powerful way. But he went and he sued them and went all the way to the Supreme Court. However, and this is a big however, they were able to get the ballot passed. The Michigan State Supreme Court says no, or they said no, the ballot can get on, and the ballot measure ended up making it after a lengthy legal battle and after the ups and downs that Katie and her team had to do in organizing to get all the signatures they need. And then even after getting all the signatures, having to take it all the way to the state Supreme Court and even the Supreme Court itself to really figure out, like, hey, man, there are people who will be actively disenfranchised by these gerrymanders. Even though the Supreme Court came out and said that, no, you have to have a specific test case where you can show that an individual or sets of individuals were harmed. Actual voters that said, you know what, my ability to vote was taken away even though I have all my stuff together. That's what the Supreme Court said, is that they needed test cases to prove the argument that they were trying to bring before them. And back in the state Supreme Court, they ended up winning the ability to actually get on the ballot, and it passed. I believe 70% to 30% was the final margin, or 69-29, or something along those lines, right? But it was a pretty huge margin, and there was a silver lining. But it's a silver lining that I had to take with a grain of salt, because I realized that even in all of this, they had managed to win this small political battle, and it took them years of organizing and strategizing and having to fight legal battles with money that they didn't even really have to even get to this point. And all it takes for a rich billionaire or a set of billionaires to make the same impact is a few phone calls and some checks. That was probably the disheartening part to the hope that they presented at the end of the doc. But it did say that there were more states that had gotten into the active process of stripping gerrymandering and political district drawing out of the hands of legislators, essentially allowing them to draw who gets to select them for their jobs, and putting it into the hands of citizen commissions that would determine those political maps. And so if you have not seen Slay the Dragon, it is uplifting, although you do have to take that uplifting with a grain of salt, but it is an uplifting documentary that reminds us of the power of the people when we come together to fight against oppressive measures inside of the system. It's a bright and insightful look on the practice of gerrymandering, and it's a documentary that's out now on Hulu that I would highly recommend that you go watch if you have not checked it out. It's highly informative and heartwarming in its own way, while it still shows the honesty and truth of the perils of our legal and political system and how those systems can be manipulated and rigged by people of greater means against the masses of people that have lesser means. Anyways, thank you guys so much for tuning in this week. We're getting ready to wrap the show up, offer a final thought. If you have not checked out Slaying the Dragon on Hulu, I highly recommend that you go do it. There might even be a copy on YouTube. Of course, if you're watching this week's episode on the YouTube channel, the No Alter Egos podcast, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe on the video. If you're listening on the radio, the video will be up Tuesday at 5 p.m. So go check it out on our YouTube channel. Leave a like, drop a comment, subscribe to the page, and hit that notification bell. Thank you guys for being here this week. Let's get to our final thought this week. And that thought for this week is that there's strength in numbers. It's one of the big lessons that I pulled from this week's documentary, is that as human beings, we severely underestimate the power of the things that we can accomplish when we get together in large enough numbers. Now, I don't subscribe to the ancient alien theory when it comes to the pyramids of Egypt. I think it was a bunch of really intelligent, really powerfully built people that got together and built those majestic wonders in Egypt. There are very few things that we can't do when we get together as a species, and we have to understand and realize that we need each other. We need each other not just to survive, but to thrive, to live our highest and best lives. So don't forget, we are stronger together. There are plenty of people who work and operate to separate and divide us. Pay them no mind. Know that working together with your fellow man, we can work and make this world a better place. We can exercise power. It takes a little bit more. It takes a little bit more dedication, time and effort and consistency, but it is possible. And there is power in the strength of numbers. So go through this week. Don't forget to show kindness to your fellow man, understanding that we're all in this same struggle together. Take care of yourselves, and as always, God bless.
Looking in the mirror, I know I'm imperfect, just like everybody else I know. Most times I wish the world looked beneath the surface, but I guess that's how life goes. Had to learn to love myself this time around. Pop a bottle and then take a sip just because. Book a flight and then take a trip just because. Love myself just because.